Well, as you may have noticed, I'm out of town this Sunday, which means one thing. Obviously, it's the beginning of a global pandemic. That's what happened the last time I went away for spring break. It would be great if you could, not do that while I was gone this time. You might have thought that since I'm gone, it means a break from sermons on giving. Ha! Gotcha. No, I recorded something in advance. Just something brief I wanted to share with you today to keep the series going before I conclude it next week. And it comes out of what we read last week in Mark's Gospel. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus is discussing the greatest commandment. And when he gives the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with your whole being, the scribe responds by saying, yep, that's basically it. But then he ends with this statement. He says, you have truly said that he is one and there is no other besides him, and to love him with all the heart and all the understanding, all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. That last bit, it's better than sacrifices. That's not something Jesus said, right? The scribe added that. What is he alluding to when he says, yes, teacher, I know that to love God is more important than sacrifices? What he's referencing is a story out of the Old Testament scriptures that they would have known very well. It's the story of the first king of Israel. His name was Saul. This comes to us from 1 Samuel chapter 15. And in that chapter, if you read it in its entirety, I won't bore you with all the details that I find interesting. Saul is commanded to go wage war against an enemy nation and to completely destroy them. They weren't supposed to profit off of this war. They were supposed to simply win it. It was supposed to be a complete victory and not something that they gained plunder from. Okay. Well, as the story goes on, if you read, Samuel gives Saul these instructions and King Saul goes to war, but then he has second thoughts about it and he decides, it's kind of a waste not to go ahead and plunder and take some spoil back home. And you know what? Hey, I'll give some of that to God. And he justifies his disobedience by saying, I was going to give it to God. Actually, he justifies it in two ways. First of all, he says, well, the people did it. The people talked me into it. But then he also says, don't worry, we're going to worship with it. God says through Samuel in verse 10 and 11, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. Two things there. We always emphasize one of those. Saul didn't keep the commandments. Okay, you're right. God said, destroy the animals. He decided to keep the animals. That's disobedience. But the other thing, he turned back from following me. What did Saul do that turned his back on God? And I want to suggest to you that it relates to the topic of giving. In verse 13, Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Like, he thinks he's done right. He doesn't think he's turned his back on God. He's wrong on both counts. Saul says, they brought them, the people, right, brought the animals from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen, the sacrifice to the Lord, and the rest we have voted to destruction. And so in Saul's mind, this is justified because ultimately he's just not being wasteful. He's going to be able to give something to God. But what's the problem? Number one, he disobeyed God, and that's a big deal. Don't minimize that. But number two, he was trying to give God something that cost him nothing. He wanted to give God something cheap. See, Saul wasn't saying, because God has given me victory, I will now rejoice and give some of my livestock and cattle as a sacrifice. No, what Saul's saying is, because I have won victory, I will take what I've won and give some of that to God. It basically cost him nothing. In fact, in reality, he was going to come out ahead. His offering was cheap, and it cheapened his devotion to God. And so in response to this, Samuel, the prophet, makes this statement, which relates to our question. What is the scribe quoting in Mark chapter 12? Samuel says this in verse 22, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to listen than the fat of rams. But there was something more important to God than just dollars and cents. In fact, from a dollar and cents point of view, what Saul has done is very practical. Round up some things that were going to be wasted, take them instead and dedicate them to God, and turn a profit. I mean, it sounds practical. It makes sense. It's just wrong. Because God doesn't need your cattle. God doesn't need your money. God needs you. He needs you in your heart and in your obedience and in your devotion, and that will be expressed in what you give. But what you give can never be a replacement for giving yourself to God. Another king of Israel knew this very, very well, and there's a reason that David, despite all his flaws, is described as a man after God's own heart. In Psalm 51, David acknowledges his sins and his failures to be fully devoted to God. And then he makes this statement in chapter 51, verse 16. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. What does David say? He says, if there was enough sacrifices I could give to make you happy with me, I would do it. But David says, I know that that's not how it works. There's not enough money, there's not enough animals, there's not enough sacrifices I could ever give to buy God off. God's not bought cheaply. He doesn't want what you own. He wants you. And of course, what you have comes with it. David goes on, again, to speak of giving. In verse 19, then will you delight in right sacrifices and burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. The bulls will be offered on your altar. Like David has every intention of making sacrifices to God and to give to God. But what David's going to give, he gives after he gives himself. Saul tried to buy God off with a cheap offering that cost him nothing and didn't require him to be obedient. David knows that he has to be obedient and committed and devoted to God first, and then the offerings flow out of that. Folks, that's the sentiment of giving in Christian scriptures as well, and it's why the scribe quotes that little phrase, it's more important than sacrifices, in referencing the greatest command. No matter what we say about giving, it has to begin with you giving yourself. There is no amount of money you can ever offer that will buy God off. He doesn't need it. What he wants, what he demands is you. And yeah, your money's going to come with it.